Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on Organize to Decolonize. How can we decolonize community engagement? I am Nafisa Tanjim. I'm an associate professor in the newly established Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at Worcester State University. And many of you probably know that this is a brand new department, and this is the very first community event our department is hosting. So we're really excited about that. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you. And I want to convey our special thanks to the Education, Liberal, and Interdisciplinary Studies Dean's Office, our Dean, Dr. Reynold Luis, our Chair, Dr. Robert Brooks, for making this happen. And of course, thanks to all of you for being here, training your students, circulating the words, and being interested in this conversation. So first I will talk briefly about why we are here, why we wanted to have this conversation with the Worcester State community before we start our panel discussion. So in this panel discussion, we will have two layers of conversations about community engagement. The first layer is about the perception of working for community as opposed to working with community. So many of us grew up with the notions of charity, giving back, volunteering, and I'm sure many of us have been told that it's a great thing to do charity, it's a great thing to help people. And yes, we should be helping people, but it's also important to be critical about the colonial paternalistic outcomes that things like charity or giving back or volunteerism can result in. And what do I mean by that? This whole thing about colonial paternalistic outcomes. So say for example, when we engage in charity, oftentimes we get to decide who we want to help, right? Very few of us actually take the time to go to the community and spend time with them, get a sense about their priorities, and then figure out a way of collaborating productively. I mean, we usually don't have that kind of time when we do charity. And charity is oftentimes a top-down approach where the money givers get to decide who to help. The same thing applies for the concept of giving back, right? When we give back, very rarely we actually inquire what we have taken from the community. And by that I mean we rarely question our own privileges, and also not everyone in our society have those privileges, right? If we just tell people give back, we are not necessarily recognizing that not all people have privileges to give back to the society. So what happens when we focus too much on things like charity or giving back is we are mostly providing band-aid solutions to our social problems. We are encouraged to go to, say, for example, a soup kitchen or homeless shelter and volunteer or give money, but we are not talking about organizing within our community to push for affordable housing policy or affordable food policy. We are not necessarily organizing for addressing the root causes of it. So we will bring all these critiques today here in our panel discussion. It's really important for us to question those colonial notions of giving back and charity and volunteerism and try to decolonize them. And what do I mean by decolonizing? Decolonizing just doesn't mean breaking free from a colonial regime. So it's not just about, oh, you have to break free from the British Empire or the American Empire. It also means becoming free from everyday injustice and discrimination that creates and sustains oppressive systems like heteropatriarchy, institutional racism, capitalism, neoliberalism, you name it. And we also wanted to talk about another layer of community engagement, the way our universities get involved with local communities, the way Worcester State is collaborating with local communities, and the way we are incorporating community-engaged learning in our curriculum. So here at Worcester State, we know that we have a strong focus on programs like nursing, education, psychology. We train our students to work with communities in various capacities. We have a Center for Civic Engagement, we have many internships and practicums, we have countless partnerships between different departments and local communities. So there is a need for us to be self-critical and self-reflexive and question how well we are actually doing in addressing power hierarchies that exist between our university and the communities we're working with. And we may love the concept or we can hate it, but all of us operate within neoliberal institutions of higher learning. And most of us teach our students how to be what Wendy Brown has framed as model neoliberal citizens. We teach them to be model neoliberal citizens, which means we teach them how to go to the outside world and fit in the oppressive interlocking system. And very rarely we actually teach them to challenge the interlocking systems of oppression. And also in our contemporary time, it has become very normalized that the rhetoric of treating students like customers has become very normalized. And we don't bat our eyes when our leaders tell us that, as faculty, as staff members, you have to treat your students like customers. So at the end of the day, we are not necessarily talking about training you, the students, to change the society. It's mostly about we get your money, so we provide you some kind of service. The service that will help you to thrive in this neoliberal world. And the universities are doing their best to cater to the need of our customer students. And I think there's a scope to think about, there's a need to think about how much of community engagement are we doing at our university that increases our market value, and how much of it is actually geared towards building solidarity with our local communities and bringing material changes. And we hope that we'll get some important food for thought from our conversation today. And today we have an exciting mix of both students and faculty who are working and organizing with communities in various capacities. We have Elle Martinez, who studies at Clark University and is a student activist based out of Boston. Their identity as a transgender person of color informs their work in legislative, nonprofit, grassroots, and public school settings. And they have extensive organizing experience around issues such as LGBTQ+ inclusion, white privilege, and harm reduction. We have Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese non-binary lesbian poet based out of Boston and also a human services student at Lesley University. They have been nominated for Best of the Net Anthology and Best New Poets Anthology. They're the author of Is the Sun Lonely Too? Zine. Their poetry can be found at the Mantle Poetry, Glass, a Journal of Poetry, and Forthcoming in Protean Magazine. And we also have Dr. Michael Lucy, who is an associate professor of political science at Lesley University and the director of the Lesley Class Honors Program, which has a focus on critical community engagement. His book on populism and peoplehood in America will come out hopefully next year. And the book talks about how we can take lessons from our various histories of social movements and engage in effective community building narratives in our contemporary times. So the way we will run the panel is we'll have more of a conversation instead of just giving talk. I have questions for all the speakers, and the speakers will take turns to respond to the questions. So I'll just move over here, and hopefully we'll be loud enough so all of you can hear us. So the first thing I wanted to ask each of you is, how do you perceive community engagement? What do you mean by organizing or decolonizing in your own work? I'm wondering, Elle.
Sure, I can start. Hi everybody, I'm Elle. When I think about community engagement, I consider engagement organizing as community care and using that care to dismantle certain systems. So I am someone who's been studying social work, and when learning about the origins of social work, we learn a lot about the settlement house movements, about Jane Addams, and really the paternalistic ways in which social work originated, and the ways in which social work originated largely as a means of kind of entertainment and not necessarily care on behalf of rich white women for more impoverished people in what were considered slums at the time. So when I reflect on that, I think about the ways in which I, as a social work student, need to ensure that my work does not include paternalism. So I consider horizontal models in order to dismantle that approach. Like Nafisa said in my introduction, I have a good amount of experience of harm reduction, meaning working with people who use substances, to ensure that they have the resources they need to make the best choices for themselves. For example, within a paternalistic mindset, I may go to someone who's using drugs and say, abstinence is the only way for you to take care of yourself and reintegrate into society, but that may not be the best or even a viable option for that person. So instead of resorting to that paternalistic mindset and thinking that I may know what's best for that person, I can have a discussion with them and say, here are the resources at my disposal. What can I do to help you make choices to improve your quality of life? And how can I leverage the power and the resources that I have in order to better your situation or circumstance? And really the goal is to not only shift that person's circumstance, but to shift the conditions that they're living in, to ensure that they have access to quality health care, to ensure that they have access to, for example, sites to test their drugs. If we think about the origin of social work, there's also a lot of emphasis on policing, social work as a form of, social work as a profession in the prison system and in the policing system. And I have witnessed in my own work, in my own communities, the ways in which policing is a form of violence perpetuated by the state. And so I have to think about the ways in which I can operate as a future social worker while considering how those systems impact the communities I'm working with and my own communities. So I'm not necessarily inclined to work in a prison, but should I end up working with a population of people who are incarcerated, what can I do that is non-paternalistic in order to improve their conditions and hopefully, in my own personal goal, lead to eventual abolition of prisons entirely and policing entirely. So as you can see, I really try to think about my organizing and my community engagement as a form of care, and care being used as a way to undermine and hopefully eventually topple those systems that are causing the negative outcomes for so many different marginalized and systemically oppressed populations.
Thank you so much, Elle. Lou, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Am I projecting enough? Okay, I am really bad at projecting my voice. So, let me start the timer. So one of the things that I really value in my own work is not charity, like being in solidarity with folks. Charity and philanthropy has been used as a tool for classism, colonization. For example, charities going into countries where there has been U.S. military interventionism, and how that ended up just being a tool to pacify folks or take away agency and autonomy from folks. So the work that I specifically do, I work with community as opposed to talking over folks. We work to address systems of repression. I work with AARW in organizing for anti-deportation work specifically. Yes, good point, thank you. So AARW stands for Asian American Resource Workshop, where I work directly with the community as opposed to in a setting where maybe people are case managers. That's not the case with AARW. We're working on the ground directly with impacted folks, often with folks who share similar experiences to ourselves or our families. And some of the things that we do is trying to address systemic oppression, as opposed to blaming the individual for their own problems. We try to engage in mutual aid as well as abolition. Something that I think was briefly mentioned was how sociology is kind of problematic as a whole. So consider the DSM and how in the past, when the DSM was created, it was mostly aimed for cis, white, heterosexual, middle-class men, and how that has done harm to communities as we are currently experiencing it. That's all.
Thank you, Blue. And I guess both Blue and Elle brought in some really interesting perspectives of how to decolonize community organizing as a student in their own fields like social work, how to practice horizontal model, how to work within a system that's characterized by police violence, that's characterized by a violent criminal justice system, and yet you can try to intervene in creative ways. We also talked about the critiques of charity, the possibilities of mutual aid. I'm wondering, Michael, if you can take a step back and bring the focus back to the university and the kind of work that you do. I mean, we're talking about organizing with communities, and what about, like organizing within the community of a university, and how do you receive that?
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about community engagement, the first thing we have to do is almost unlearn some of the things that we think we know, because oftentimes, like, it is pitched as we need to do community engagement because we want to solve a problem, we need to empower students, we need all this language, give them opportunities to improve their resumes so they can get jobs. And on a university level, the university looks at community engagement favorably because they can count how many hours students participate in that. They can take photos and put it on their website. It can improve their brand. And obviously, all of this is not exactly trying to address the structures of oppression that really harm so many people, right? And so I think when we're, how to perceive community engagement and organizing, I think the first thing we have to think about is, like, what are our traditional narratives of community engagement, and then how do we challenge those? At Lesley, it sounds like the student body has some similarities with Worcester State, and that is, we emphasize in our literature, in our advocacy, that, a lot of our students are going to go into helping professions. They're going to become therapists, they're going to become teachers. One of the things that I want to emphasize with community engagement is, rather than saying, okay, you can go solve all these problems, why don't we look inside first and make sure that we're actually capable of solving these problems? And what that means is really getting students and all of us to look inside and looking at, what's my position in relation to the community that I want to work with? What privileges do I have? What's the history that people have had in that community with people who look like me or come from similar environments? A lot of times there's problematic history there. And if we don't understand that, then, the first of that term in community engagement is community. Well, to build a community, you have to have a relationship with people. And to build a relationship with people, you have to actually understand, where you're coming from and where they're coming from, and actually build trust. And that's a long process, and so I think a lot of times we skip over that process and we say, okay, we have 30 hours to spend on this, go do something. And I think that is problematic. And the other thing I wanted to say about community engagement is, in terms of community, I think we need to problematize, what do we mean by community? Because oftentimes, when you hear the word community engagement, you're probably thinking, okay, we need to go out to a community. But that's posing the university as a separate community from whatever community you're working with. And that can be problematic, right? I mean, the university, look at how many different people are in this room, how many different people go to this university, and even the different positions of the people in the university. There's administrators, there's staff, there's faculty. And even within those groups, there's people with different privileges and power. And so, and we need to analyze that too. In my own work, there's times when I've sort of assumed that people had certain privileges in my classroom, and then had an assignment and said, whoa, this really puts burden on one group and not another group. And so I needed to kind of look at, like, my own students. So, so in terms of community engagement, I think we need to sort of unlearn what we were told probably previously, at least what I was told. I shouldn't assume what your background is with this. But when I went to high school, they were like, you need to go give back, you need to volunteer, because so much has been given to you, now help. And the help gives me a position of authority over another community, and that's really problematic. We can't address the structures of oppression if we're going in thinking that we are better in whatever community we're trying to work with and build a relationship with.
Thank you, Michael. That's very powerful. So, Michael, you mentioned it's really important to actually start with the question of who we are, framing the we, understanding the history of this we. And I'm wondering if the panelists can reflect on this specific question of we, and specifically how you personally deal with this question of, framing the we. Like, who you are and what kind of power relationships you are engaged in. How do you reflect on your own positionalities, specifically in terms of, like identities and experiences like race, sex, gender, ethnicity, religion, nationality, and so on. So yeah, how do you perceive this week? How do you reflect on your own positionality?
Yeah, I can go next. Yes, I can go next. Sorry. So I grew up in Section 8 housing, as well as I grew up on food stamps. It's not something that I'm used to. Also, my family has been directly impacted by war. I'm Vietnamese, my family is Vietnamese, as well as like there are some other histories when it comes to families that have been impacted by war and genocide, or some that does get lost. Like for example, on my mom's side, there's Khmer, as well as Kangchu, and there's groups are heavily oppressed in Southeast Asia. What is the question again? Yes. Thank you. I also am a queer trans person. I identify as a non-binary lesbian. How this impacts my work and what I do in this space is, so with my organizing work, I'm working directly with people who have shared experiences. I'm not coming from a place where I am like talking down or talking over with people, but coming from a place of understanding and shared experiences. I think something that's also important in the work that I do is making sure that I'm not taking the mic from someone who might need it, more so as just like actually working alongside with people, providing support, providing solidarity with folks. Positionality in the work that I do. That is such a good question. Thank you, Elle. This is my emotional support classmate, who's no longer my classmate, but it's my emotional support Nguyen. Within the work that I do, I think it kind of informs like how I approach the work, just making sure that I'm not talking over people, not like thinking that I'm better than someone that I'm working with. And also, I think I'm in a very lucky setting where at AARW, which stands for Asian American Resource Workshop, we work alongside folks. We're not like case managers, we're not talking over people. It's more so like in solidarity. A lot of the work that I do is around like anti-deportation organizing on a local level as well as on a national level. I'm still very new to the national and federal level of organizing. That's just something that I've been introduced to recently within this year. I'm more familiar with local organizing, such as working with district attorneys, working with like state level. Thank you. ADHD, right?
That also affects
That also affects how I work. I think that is it.
Thank you. That's powerful. Elle?
Sure. When I think about my kind of background, when I first started organizing, it was really out of the need to have a space for myself and people like me and out of survival. I started organizing very, very early on in high school with small clubs, but then I also got into the kind of national LGBTQ nonprofit sector, as well as lobbying in the Massachusetts State House. And that started like my freshman, sophomore year. So I kind of knew that I wanted to get into community engagement organizing very early. I grew up in a majority white suburban town. I'm from Natick, which is right outside of Boston. And I'm mixed race. I'm half white, half Afro-Latino, and growing up in that area gave me a lot of opportunities in terms of education, in terms of technology, in terms of public resources. But as a result of the environment, I also faced a lot of violence and trauma. I was not as successful in school as I could have been because of the identities I hold as a trans person of color. So my privileges are kind of weighed by that trauma and violence that I've incurred. But that white suburban upbringing has also prepared me to enter white majority spaces, which are very prevalent in pretty much every institution and university and college. So when I think about how that's impacted my organizing, I think about the ways in which I have become very accustomed from being very young at an early age to speak for myself, to not rely on adults in my spaces to protect me, to ally with other people, to find true allies and friends in those spaces. And I also learned to look out for my own safety. I have organized many a protest or walkout, and when you're dealing with those situations, especially if you are speaking out against an institution, the idea of consequence for that action, of possible state or police intervention is something to be considered. And that's something that I often had to consider for myself when I first started out, because I was in white majority spaces that did not necessarily understand that I could incur and kind of inequitable forms of violence compared to my peers when taking that action. And that sense of self and worry about my safety shifts depending on the space that I'm in. So being in college right now and being surrounded by more trans organizers of color who have more understanding of how institutional and state violence works, I don't need to be as concerned about my own safety in a group sense. And I think other senses of power and positionality, I am Puerto Rican, and I think that that identity very much holds a lot of grief and loss for my people, for the indigenous identity that I'm trying to reclaim. And it can be very difficult being American and living on the mainland and being Puerto Rican because so little is really known by the wider American population about Puerto Rico, about the state of finances, the state of the environment, of legislation. So some identities that I hold can feel very lonely, but those things can change. I have since moved out to Worcester and found a much larger Boricua Puerto Rican population, and really been able to feel more at home in my identity, practice my Spanish more with my peers, using actual Puerto Rican Spanish and not just kind of generic academic Spanish. So my senses of kind of power and positionality have really changed depending on the spaces that I've held throughout my life.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think about this question in relation to a classroom, because I spend a lot of my time in classrooms, and you know, as a professor, there's obviously a power inequity just because of, you know, I'm tasked as a job to teach in the classroom, and I'm seen as an authority, and I have to assign grades, and that creates a hierarchy, right? And that hierarchy can really get in the way of teaching, because maybe you don't see your classrooms like this, but your best classrooms are going to be mini communities, where people actually get to know one another and they get to trust one another. But how do you do that? Right? Like here we have a podium, right? And with microphones. So I can walk up to that podium and then put up a PowerPoint and then talk at you all. That's one way to interact. Another would be to try to democratize the classroom a little bit to the extent that you can, and make sure that people's voices are heard. Because when I'm talking about things like decolonizing community engagement, I need all the voices in the room to actually contribute to that, because my background doesn't have all of those experiences. I don't see everything, and we need all of those voices for everyone to see those voices in order to counter those dominant narratives that are so prevalent, that kind of keep things in place. The reason why we don't see these interlocking structures of oppression is because it's seen as common sense, right? We don't talk about how 20% of US children live in poverty. Why? That seems very significant, right? We don't talk about, you know, how many people are housing insecure very often, and what policies keep those in place. Because we have certain narratives that kind of don't put a spotlight on those things. But we have people who experience them. And if you have people telling their story, and you actually kind of take a step back. I mean, I have so many privileges, not only as the professor in the classroom, but I'm a white male, cisgender, the class privilege. And so I think stepping back and actually opening space for people to have more equality in the classroom, to build more trust in the classroom is one way to recognize, the power and positionality that I have in the classroom and try to empower other voices who have other experiences that I don't have. And that's how one way I think we can try to create a community on on a classroom level, on a smaller level.
Thank you, Michael. The last question I had for all of you is, so far you have reflected on your own position on the days. You have talked about how you perceive decolonizing community engagement. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about specific examples of how you organize with communities, the challenges you faced while you're doing this, and what your main takeaways were, what you learned from that experience. Were you able to decolonize? Was it more like a process? What do you think? Michael, you want to start this one?
Sure. So I should start like I tried to transform the honors program at Leslie, which was sort of just based off of academics, and I thought there was something missing from our curriculum that we didn't have, and that was we had all of these people going to the helping professions, into teaching, into therapy, and all this stuff, but most of them didn't get any of this discussion about positionality and reflexivity. And to me, that was really dangerous. To have people who are going to be on the front lines dealing with all sorts of different communities and not actually having investigated the histories of these communities and their position in relation to them, I thought was something that we needed to address at Leslie. And so we tried to shift the curriculum to what we were calling critical community engagement. And in terms of the question about, is this a process or is this a goal that we can achieve? To me, it's a process, and it's a process that I am so far away from actually achieving decolonizing our community engagement on our campus, and I'll explain why. And most of it has to do with trying to do it within a neoliberal university. So what does that all mean? Well, when I went to the university and said, okay, I want to set this program up, they're like, oh, great, we have a great internship office, so speak with them. Okay, so I go to the internship office, and they have partnerships with all these different, basically nonprofits in the area. And so what happens is, in the first iteration, I have to get it together for the semester. We end up kind of replicating the internship experience. Now, the internships are mostly with service providers, large service providers who have enough resources to have supervisors who can, basically supervise the students who are doing those hours. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is I'm trying to challenge all these different narratives, and I'm actually feeding those same narratives. I am putting the Band-Aid on and having my students put the Band-Aid on, rather than trying to, the goal of critical community engagement is that you wouldn't have people who are food insecure. There'd be enough food, there'd be enough housing, but my students weren't working on those issues. And they weren't working on those issues because the internship office wasn't working on those issues, and I didn't have the resources to kind of make the kind of partnerships with the grassroots organizations who are working on those things. So the next year, and students really called us out when we were trying to do this and say, look, the literature says this, and you're doing what the literature says is colonizing. And I was like, you're right, I'm sorry, I'll try to do better, right? I mean, that's all you can do. And so the next iteration, we partnered with grassroots organizations who were working on trying to change the structures of the profession. But we had students who were in a semester. How much can you do in a semester when you have your other coursework? And then the supervisors at these grassroots organizations, they didn't have as much money or time. So now you're taking people who are working on these foundational issues away from their work to work with my students. There's a little bit of injustice there, and there's a little bit of elitism there that I was very uncomfortable with by the end of the semester. So the third time I taught the class, we changed the whole model again. We said we can't do this to the supervisors. We need to get students who already took our class to be the site supervisors. So we brought those students back, and they led projects on food justice, on housing justice, on environmental justice, and voting justice. And those went better, but then there's still a problem even within that, even with all those things going on. You can't escape the semester model. And what I mean by that is, you can't solve these issues or even understand these issues fully in the 15, 16 weeks you have. And you don't want to tell people, okay, go do this, and then they do it for show, right? They do it for your class, and then the work it stops, right? And so we tried to fix that by having students, start student groups that extended it outside of the classroom, made it more sustainable. But then some of those students also felt overwhelmed. There's only a few of them who are really keeping those student groups going, and they didn't feel like they had enough institutional support. All of this to say is, I think decolonizing, it's one, you want to see these issues that you don't see before, but then trying to work on them, you're going to find that a lot of forces are going to push you back into the mainstream way of doing community engagement. Like, let's go solve an issue in one day. We used to have MLK Day of Service, and we went out and we picked up trash, or we did something else. And that looks good for the university. They can count that, people feel good about it, but it's not really addressing those fundamental issues. And those are the things that are easier to do. And every time you try to go off of the colonized track and decolonize, you're kind of pushed back. And so, so I'm still working on it. I don't have an answer to that.
Thank you, Michael. Elle?
Yeah. When I think about forms of decolonization within my own work, a couple different examples come up. When Nafisa sent us these questions, I was still kind of processing this, but I spent some time last night, and I was thinking about the ways in which I've practiced decolonization that have really brought me joy. And during the pandemic, so 2 years back, I was a part of a program by the organization Unbound Bodies, which is based in Boston, and they are a QT BIPOC or queer, trans, and Black, Indigenous people of color collective that hosts different types of events. And essentially I was a part of an interview series where we were put in touch with several different Black and Latinx elders from the Boston community, LGBTQ elders, and I and a couple of other younger queer folks of color interviewed them about what their lives were like when they were our age, the activities they went to, the crowds they ran with, the places that really felt true to them. And we were able to document all of that information, in some cases do research and find articles or pieces of media that they had referred us back to. And ultimately all of that information went into a project to form an altar for that person in the city of Boston. And those altars were put up for several days to a week, and people were able to go visit to learn about that person, learn about different times in their life, learn about the people and the spaces that were so important to them growing up as a queer person of color. And that is an example of really decolonizing, doing something independent from institutions, doing something that is, that is care at its core. And that was a really insightful and joyful organizing experience for me. And I think that's really important, especially for queer folks and folks of color, where, at least in my experience, organizing out of need of survival is just not joyful a lot of the time. It can be very stressful. It can be exhausting. So having that type of organizing involve joy, I think was really significant for me. Another instance that I think about is, I was actually talking about this earlier with everybody on the panel. I have recently been accepted into a mutual aid organization at Clark University called the CU Collective, which is an organization that is completely independent from the university, that collects funding in order to fulfill mutual aid requests, things like tuition overages, books food, really any kind of core need that students have that they are able to afford, are able to obtain for themselves and can obtain through, for example, a place like the Dean's office. It's especially important and impactful for our international students at Clark who don't have access to nearly as many kind of support networks as domestic students do. And I have been working with this group for only a couple of weeks, but it's really exciting work. I've done mutual aid work before, but having a completely student-run independent organization from the university is really important to me. And it's not the first time that I've been a part of a necessarily university-based organization outside of that university. It's really important to me to be independent from these institutions because with institutional funding comes expectations, comes rules, and comes general hoops that you have to jump through. And given how white supremacy is really baked into every institution we have in this country, it can be very difficult to navigate those systems and also meet the needs of students. So that's kind of another reason why this mutual aid organization is so exciting to me. And we also see on Clark's campus how the process of being involved in an institution can cause conflict and harm. Right now at Clark there is a tension going on between the students and the institution as to who is running the food pantry that has historically been student-run on campus for several years now. The institution is looking to pass it over to a nonprofit entity in the community. So this kind of leads to a lot of questions. You know, are we, you know, in our goal to try to decolonize this process of getting food to people, does it make sense to be passing off this student-run entity to a nonprofit that historically has no basis on this campus? You know, this pantry is institutionally funded. What does that mean for the products that we're able to dole out to students? What does that mean for the amount of products we're able to get? So I think when I think about how decolonization impacts my work, I really think about working outside of institutions. And I think that that's where I've really found the most fulfilling work that I've done. And I really, really value having that independence because I really do believe that if you're working outside of an institution, you're able to cast a wider net of care past, you know, even your campus into the community itself. And there's a lot less gatekeeping, less hoops that you need to jump through. It can be more difficult to be on a horizontal model of organizing. It can be more difficult to have a large body of students making decisions. But I think in a lot of ways, especially in collaboration between grad students, undergrad students, and professors, I've really done my best work organizing with all groups of people outside of institutions because I think it really can do the most good and allow people to have the most options at their disposal.
Thank you, Elle. That's so powerful. I'm so glad that you brought in this whole question of whether we should be working outside of institutions and also this, you know, like debate between mutual aid versus working through nonprofit organizations. And many of us probably know that most of the nonprofit organizations in the United States are registered as 501c3 organizations. And when you register as a 501c3 organizations, you are legally prohibited from spending too much of your resources in political organizing. You just can't do that. There are IRS restrictions. So mutual aid is a creative way of working outside of institutions, and hopefully we'll learn more about it from all of you when we have the Q&A session. Luke.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Elle, and also Michael. So some of the work that I have done, I'm going to focus more so on the anti-deportation organizing work, specifically with the Southeast Asian and Vietnamese community. And then if I have time by the end, kind of touch upon the transformative justice mural, art for change, and other topics that I've been a part of. So specifically with the anti-deportation organizing, ARW is a part of a national coalition called Southeast Asian Freedom Network. Something that we recently just had was, what day is it? The 27th? I believe so, it's the 27th. So about a week ago, a bunch of folks met up in DC in order to introduce a bill and hold a rally fighting the good versus bad narrative, good versus bad immigrant narrative, which comes into play throughout all of my organizing work, because unfortunately there's a lot of biases that are held within our systems and also within individuals. Some of the things that we have done is the Storytelling Project, which we're currently working on, where folks are coming together who are impacted by deportation, who have gone through different experiences when it comes to refugee status, to immigration, and having gone through the prison industrial complex system, and being able to tell their stories of how they do deserve to be here despite everything. Another thing that we recently just did at AARW is the art exhibition. And something that AARW has done in the past is do a documentary called Keeping Saray Home. And that kind of highlighted 3 different families who were directly impacted by deportation, who worked directly with us, and it ended up helping successfully keep one of our community members at home in the US and keep him from being deported. So why this work is so important is because there's not a whole lot of understanding about like the prison industrial system or the prison to deportation pipeline or US military interventions in other countries and how that directly impacts people. I think when the narratives that are currently being popularly told are told by people who are continuously regurgitating bigoted language and xenophobic language, that directly impacts the policies that we have for people. It directly impacts how communities view people. So that's something that we're trying to fight. Another thing is like keeping folks in the US, stopping deportations. A large part of the work I do includes like abolition. So that means cops, that means prison, that means deportation. And just a reminder for folks, ICE has not always existed. Like ICE as a system has not just always been there. Like there is another world that is possible, like a better world that is possible for all people. Some of the challenges that we face in general, or that I have run into, is like bureaucracy, time, capacity, change in politics. These are all things that are kind of external, whether it's local or national or statewide organizing. Regardless, those are the things that come up consistently. And then to quickly touch upon like the transformative justice mural kind of coming together with community members and working directly with the family of Rita Hester to honor her death. That's fair. So Rita Hester is a Black trans woman who was murdered in Allston, Massachusetts, which is a part of Boston. Essentially, her death had sparked the Trans Day of Remembrance movement worldwide. However, she's not often very much recognized, and Allston never really paid tribute to her. And so we ended up, like a group of folks ended up working together with Rita's family to get this mural in honor of her living memory, of her joy, of her, just in honor of her. And then Art for Change, I have exactly 10 seconds to talk about that. Okay. So Art for Change was a student-led collective that Elle kind of was briefly a part of a little bit. There was a lot going on. So capacity was low for all
Institutions make it very difficult to do
Yes,
this work.
it is true. They really do. So Art for Change was a student-led collective that I was a part of and helped run and facilitate with my wonderful co-facilitator, Ray, who is not here, but is here emotionally, kind of. And some of the things that we tried to focus on was utilizing art, our love for poetry or dance or movement or painting or graffiti, etc. Like any type of art in order to speak out about different issues that are going on in the community. And we also ended up partnering with a lot of cool groups. I think I went over my time.
You're good, you're
Okay.
good. Thank you so much, Luke.
No problem.
So we have about 25 minutes for Q&A. Why don't we do a quick pair share? Could you just speak to the folks sitting next to you and talk a little bit about the most interesting thing you learned from this panel discussion? If there is any question you want to ask, do you have any critiques of the stuff that we're saying? So let's take about 3 minutes for doing a quick pair share, and then we'll come back as a big group, and we'll be very interested in hearing what you want to share with us. Okay, so 3 minutes from now, and please reach out to the folks sitting next to you and have a brief conversation. Alright, so let's come back. We have about 20 minutes. And let's see what you think about the panel discussion. Have any questions? Yeah. Questions for the panelists? Did anything stand out to you? Do you want to say about it? I don't know, I haven't thought about that, but this gave me some useful food for thought. Do you want to share about your own experience of organizing with communities, the challenges you faced? Yes.
I was going to ask you. So you talked a lot about when working with communities, the importance of working with them and not really putting yourself in a position above them and really hearing what they want to say. How do you balance your own ideas as an outsider in the communities that you're coming into, or as?
So I would say that I'm a part of the community that I'm coming into as a Vietnamese person whose family has also been directly impacted by war and immigration, refugee, etc. And also as someone who has grown up in like community housing, low-income housing. But I think mostly to balance out some of my ideas is the people that I work with and organize with. So again, like with my position, I'm not like a case manager or a caseworker, more so community organizer. I'm friends with the people that I organize with. Like I go over for dinner. I can't cook, but we'll go to a restaurant. But I'll come over theirs for dinner. Like I think a lot of it is just having conversation. Like I'm like, hey, here's a cool idea we can try. Oh, you hate that idea? Okay, let's try something else. So I think a large part of it is like being able to actually talk to the people, building trust, like actually being a part of the community. I also think it can be hard to do that in certain settings, because I did like back when I was freshman in college, I tried the mental health setting, and it's completely different for reasons, where it does feel like there's a large disconnect from the people that you're working with, and there's a more clear like power imbalance, and where in the mental health setting, I did notice like a lot of the folks that you're working with don't have a lot of say. Am I allowed to swear? Well, I think
sure.
Thank you. Thank you, person in overalls to the side of the room. Again, like what was discussed earlier, there are a lot of like mental health organizations and other nonprofit organizations that are incredibly fucked up and need a lot of changing, in the sense of like there's not a lot of power being given to people that you're supposed to be working with, if that makes any sense.
Thank you. And I think, thank you so much for bringing up that question. And I think this whole question of insider versus outsider and how exactly you relate to the community is so relevant, because you can never completely claim your insider status, because there's so many dynamics of identities and power relationships. So I'm wondering if Elle and Michael, would you also want to briefly reflect on how do you juggle between this insider versus outsider status as you engage with communities?
Would you like to start, or should I? I can start, yeah. I think that the power of like consent and questions are really important in spaces that maybe you're not necessarily, you haven't built trust with, or you're new to, because, and this is something I've definitely learned through experience, helping people can be paternalistic in itself. Asking people if you could help can be a really powerful way of building trust and honoring someone's independence. And I also think, I think that questions are really important and consent is really important, because especially in, like, for example, someone who's lacking in housing or someone who is disabled. You know, if someone is using mobility aid like crutches or a wheelchair, you wouldn't go up to them and push their wheelchair for them. At least I hope you wouldn't. You would ask first, and you would leave it up to that person in their own sense of autonomy to see what kind of help, if any at all, that they need. So I think that, you know, consent to help, consent to intervene is really important. Obviously, there are, you know, kind of more dire situations where help may need to be more immediate. But I think we've reiterated on this panel before, just internalizing the fact that when you're entering a community, that community knows what's best for them. That community understands and has been working on fixing whatever problems they're facing. And in turn, there is a lot to learn from them before you intervene and really take any kind of action.
Yeah, in terms of insider and outsider, I mean, I think it's important to actually try to answer that question for yourself, because you're going to have more trust and more power a lot of times when you're an insider in that community. And that means, like, all right, so I'm a white male, right? And if I'm in a very white space, people might listen to me. And that means rather than go into another space and think I know the right answer, maybe I could take someone else's concerns and then go into the space where I'm an insider and say, no, this is something we need to concentrate on, right? And that's kind of knowing, like, your position in relation to other different communities and where you're an insider and where you're an outsider. And that's, I mean, you're not either or, right? A lot of times you're kind of an insider to some and not to others. But I think we have to actually figure that out, and then what privileges that gives us, and then what vulnerabilities it gives us in other places.
Thank you. Yes. I'm sorry. Was there like someone with a question? Yes, please.
So you guys often spoke of neoliberalism, and I feel like a lot of people don't really understand what neoliberalism is, because that's not like an intro-friendly word.
Yeah.
So can you guys explain what neoliberalism is, and then talk about what it was like going against, in some ways, institutions like, I know Elle mentioned that they're from Clark, and what was it like to go against, like, your institutions like that?
Yeah, sure. So neoliberalism, I mean, one easy way to think about it is you take marketplace values and you apply them to everything. Now, marketplace values, you know, like competition, you have supply and demand, all these kinds of ideas. And, you know, let's say markets work. A lot of times they don't work. Well, let's say markets work. The problem isn't just that markets don't work all the time. It's that they supplant other ways of thinking about things and other value systems. I'll give you an example. Democracy is not a marketplace. We have one person, one vote. It doesn't matter how meritorious we're supposed to. I understand that there's a lot of voter suppression stuff. But the idea behind democracy is one person, one vote, right? That is not a marketplace. And when you impose the marketplace on it, you replace that notion. Let me give you a really other quick example of how you can corrupt ideas. There was this daycare center, and it happened to be in Israel, and there was a problem with kids being picked up late, right? So the employees had to stay after. That was really not good for the employees. And they said, you know what? We need parents to come sooner, so we're going to charge. I'm just going to make up this, like $5 a minute for every minute it's late. We're going to charge $5. And what happened was more people came late. Now, what happened there? Well, people didn't want to inconvenience the workers. But then when they figured out it was a market relationship, oh, I'm paying for this minute. Well, then, I just choose to pay. So you changed the whole way people thought about that. Market values invaded those other values. And this happens in relationships. Think about your education. Dr. Panji talked about viewing you all as customers. That's different from viewing you as future citizens who will shape the rules, who will change those interlocking structures of oppression. And the way you kind of interact with that is going to be different. And so your question about, okay, so why is it so hard to then work against the institution? Well, if the institution, when institution makes their budgets, that's where they're telling you what their priorities are. And wherever they put their money is going to be what neoliberals put their money. They're going to put their money on things that they can show. Things that they can show our students, are doing X, Y, and Z that makes us look good. They're getting these jobs, and that makes us look good. And they're not going to put their money on those other values, like the decolonizing projects.
Sure, yeah. So I'm pretty new to Clark. I am a transfer as of this semester, but I used to attend Leslie, which is where Michael currently works and where Nafisa used to work. And I did a lot of organizing at Leslie on a lot of different levels, a lot in collaboration with professors, some with the unions, and a lot in collaboration with students. And I think I've organized against institutions my entire life, especially academic institutions, and I found that the difficulty really lies in the power difference. Example, you've probably all heard the term retaliation. That is definitely a formalized term in the context of academic institutions. So if I, as a real world example, hold a protest calling for the removal of the president of the university, which I did, if I do that, how will I be treated by the administration? How will I be treated by my teachers? Will my grades be affected? Will my ability to access different spaces on campus be affected? Will my financial aid be affected? That power difference leaves me as an organizer amongst my fellow student organizers in a real vulnerable state. So I think that is one of the most difficult things about organizing within an institution. And if we're kind of connecting it back to neoliberalism, my protest against the president is not marketable. That is not a part of the values that the institution holds. That is not something that benefits them. If you're going against the grain, you're talking about issues that are considered to be controversial, whether that be white supremacy, whether that be gender and sexuality. If you're going against neoliberalism and you're in a position of vulnerability, then you are subject to danger in terms of how you're treated by the institution or whether or not the institution really works for you after the fact.
Thank you, Elle. Other questions or comments? Yes.
So I just have a question. So you guys mentioned a lot about community engagement and basically community building, but also that ideology of making sure that the community wants that help before you go into it. So how would you guys approach, for example, Worcester State is a community, quote unquote, but it's a community that you can clearly see that there's a predominantly white population. So some things that you see as, a person of color or a person of a different sexuality or a different origin might not be fair to you, I guess. So how would you approach a community that the majority does not think that there's an issue, but you can overall see that there is issues within that community?
That's a really good question. Do you want me to start? If you
I think so, yeah. I spoke earlier about kind of organizing in white majority spaces, and there's a real difficulty in being in a space where you see a problem, but seemingly nobody else or the majority of them, especially if you're somebody who's at the intersections of this problem existing and experiencing that problem, especially within a group environment. It is always a good idea to find allies and also find peers who are experiencing the same things you are. I understand that that's not an easy thing to do, especially in a large university and institution. I would say that if you aren't able to find people who recognize that problem then perhaps pull in different forms of media that might help those people understand the problem, to save yourself really the emotional energy and the time. And if you're still not able to find or gain really support within that environment to solve that problem, then possibly reaching even further outside of that group to organizations possibly outside of the university. I also think there's a lot of power in kind of cross-university and kind of cross-cultural exchange between organizations, for example, at Worcester State and at Clark. There are people doing all kinds of work. All issues are being worked on by people in their communities, outside of their communities, and there are going to be people who recognize those issues, but I think it is very difficult oftentimes to find people in proximity, especially in white majority spaces.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Elle. So I think, one, taking care of yourself first, finding other folks who kind of align with your values and understand the situation that's going on. I think reaching out to different organizations, student organizations and clubs on campus that maybe kind of are also in alignment with some of our beliefs and values. And I think regardless it's going to be difficult because at any primarily white institution, there's going to be a lot of barriers, whether it's from primarily white student body, admin. It's going to be really difficult, but similar to what Elle said, being able to find in your own community and within clubs and cross-campus clubs and organizations, being able to kind of work together and being able to discuss these issues. I think don't stop talking about it. Sometimes you have to be loud about things, even if the university doesn't want to hear it, or if the white student body doesn't want to hear it. But also think about your safety and your mental health while doing that, and definitely practice self-care. But yeah, definitely make a ruckus.
I'm telling people that if you can make a space for people to understand the consequences of that policy, on different people, especially if you can find other people who are affected by whatever that policy is or whatever that thing that's happening is, and having them sort of tell those consequences, this is why, this is how this is harming us in very specific ways. But the problem that happens is if you don't have people who are sympathetic to that, then it can be just so exhausting. And so it can be harmful to those students too. So you have to figure out whether it makes sense, if the cost is really worth it, because there is a cost.
Well, and it seems like you guys are fighting against injustice and biases, stereotypes. But the question to you, I don't mean to put you on the spot. Do you guys find yourselves having sometimes biases, stereotypes? Will you be able to talk to a professor the same way if I excuse my language, if a junkie nodding out was sitting next to you? Would you guys see them the same? Or for example, if somebody had ideas that are against neoliberalism or against accepting trans, would you guys have bias? Or would you, because you're fighting against inequality, but sometimes we ourselves become unjust with others. Do you guys ever have that happen to you? And I guess this is a question for everybody. A lot of us will go into social services, but do we really see these people as equals all the time? Or people who have different ideologies than us? Do we accept them?
We all have very really complicated identities, right? And some identities you can see and some you can't see. And so, you asked a very specific question. Yeah, I have all sorts of blind spots, and they happen, and I make mistakes, and I try not to, and I try to correct them, I try to acknowledge them, especially when they're in the classroom, but even outside, and but we all do, right? Even like in different, we can't know everyone's situation. We can't have full empathy with everyone in the sense that we know what they're going through. We don't, right? And we all have certain experiences that we feel more comfortable in, and others that we don't. And we need to try to recognize those. And so I think the biggest thing is one, try to limit any kind of harm you do, but then two, when you make a mistake, make sure you make a correction on that, right? I mean, you don't do that again. And I don't know, I have lots of blind spots, and I'm still working on it.
We have 3 minutes left, so each of you will just reflect on this for 1 minute.
Yeah, I think unlearning biases is a lifelong process. We're all unlearning and relearning things as we go. Like, it's not just you read one book or you read one article and suddenly cure a biases. That's just not how that works. Like, learning is a lifelong journey. I would say that we're kind of dedicated to, right?
Yeah, I think a really important part of my life and my work is accountability. If I'm someone who is ascribing to the ideology of abolition, I believe that there are alternative methods for people to be accountable, to be held accountable, for justice to be brought. And that means living my values. That means admitting and apologizing and making amends if I make a mistake or if I cause harm to somebody. That means admitting when I need to take a step back because I actually don't know the context of what's being spoken about or the issue that's being talked about. If we're going to be involved in community, we have to take responsibility for our own actions. And sometimes that is admitting, I'm not comfortable with this, but I need to be, and that's something that I can work on. Sometimes that's admitting, I caused harm to this person, and I need to make amends and ensure that it doesn't happen again in the future. Accountability is very much, I think, at the core of a lot of community organizing engagement.
Thanks, everyone. So we're running out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you got a really holistic perspectives coming from student activists, coming from professors, to think through how we can decolonize community engagement. And as you all perhaps got the idea that decolonization is not necessarily an end goal. We can never say that if you do like 10 different things, you will be decolonizing the world. It does not work like that. It involves continuous questioning of your own positionality, who you are, what your biases are, what your stereotypes are, and how you can work through that. It also sometimes involves working within the institutions. It might involve working outside of the institution. And most importantly, this is a process. Sometimes it's a very frustrating process. Sometimes it's a really slow process, but it's an invaluable process that can eventually challenge interlocking systems of oppression. So hopefully this session will be useful for you. Thank you so much.